thought I'd start today with some bad news, followed by some good news. I was in Toronto yesterday. No, that's not the bad news. However, we had a meeting of our board of directors yesterday. So I had to take a late flight last night from Toronto to Edmonton. I got to the hotel about midnight and was able to turn the TV on just as the shootout was happening in the women's hockey game. So that's the bad news, of course, is we lost the gold medal to our colleagues from the south of the border. Sean, Canadians are you know, the stereotypical, polite, etc., but when it comes to hockey, we're not. So no gloating when you get up here on the stage. The good news is at our board of directors meeting yesterday, our board gave final approval to a new strategic plan for CADTH. So that's great news for me. And I hope that's good news for you because this is the first opportunity, the first audience that I'm going to talk to about our new strategic plan. And this is it. Transforming how we manage health technologies in Canada. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we're going in the direction we're going, with a lot of disruption happening currently in both the pharmaceutical space and in the medical technology space, and more disruption coming in the future. And then what we plan to do with all of our partners, all the people that Justin talked about here in Alberta, and Alberta has such a wealth of expertise in that health technology assessment field, and many of them in the room here today. So first off, though, I better tell you a little bit about who CADTH is. I'm hoping most of you know CADTH, at least in the periphery, that we do produce good evidence, and hopefully many of you do think of us as a world leader in the work that we do in supporting jurisdictions across Canada. So we are a not-for-profit. We're not a government organization, but about 85% of our funding does come from government sources. The federal government, through Health Canada, provides about 60% of our funding. All of the provinces and territories, with the exception of Quebec, who has their own agency, ANS, provide about 25% of our funding. So thank you to Alberta Health, of course, for the funding that they provide. And then about 15% of our funding comes through an application fee that we charge to the pharmaceutical industry for the drugs we review in our Common Drug Review and Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review. And we raise a small amount of money through events and other things as well. So I've got about 200 staff, and that's going to be growing significantly over the next few years. Our head office is in Ottawa. We have an office as well in Toronto now. And we kind of consider ourselves as a health technology assessment agency, but we want to transform into a health technology management enterprise, and that's what I'll get into with our new strategic plan. So we have two main portfolios, one related to pharmaceuticals and one related to medical devices and all of the associated technologies and clinical interventions. On the drug side, our two flagship programs are the Common Drug Review and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review. Each of those programs are set up with an expert committee chaired by, in the case of the Common Drug Review, by somebody from Alberta, Dr. Jim Silvius, geriatrician from Calgary, and our PCODER Expert Review Committee by an oncologist from Toronto, Dr. Maureen Trudeau, breast cancer specialist. So we look at all of the evidence. We receive the submissions on all new drugs that are approved by Health Canada, and we do a very significant review of both the clinical effectiveness, the cost effectiveness, input that we receive from patient groups. We put that all together in our expert committees through a very extensive deliberative framework, come out with recommendations to all of the public drug plans in Canada, again with the exception of Quebec. I won't say that again, it's implied in everything that we do. So those are for individual drugs and lots of new things that we're going to be doing in our drug space. We also do reviews on classes of drugs, therapeutic class reviews, optimal use reports on how to best utilize pharmaceuticals. This is just a few examples of some of the reports that we've done over the past few years. The second line therapies for type 2 diabetes, we had initiated a project to look at third-line therapies for diabetes. But as we were discussing this report with some of the expert endocrinologists, we understood that there were a lot of new pivotal clinical trials underway for some of these newer agents that are looking at the cardioprotective effects of these agents. And we felt it was important that we had all of that information before we came out with new recommendations. So we've paused that therapeutic review, and we'll restart it once those studies start coming to light in 2019. In the health technology management side for the medical devices, and medical devices for us is a short way of saying it's medical, dental, surgical devices, procedures and programs, and diagnostics and clinical interventions, everything that's not a drug. We do another one of our flagship programs is this rapid response program, where any one of our customers in the public health care system can pose a question to us, whether they're from a health ministry, a health authority, a hospital, pose a question. And we do about 300 or so of those rapid evidence reviews every year. They don't go through an expert body, there's no recommendation, but it gives you with the conclusions and some key messages on any type of technology, whether it's a drug or a medical device or a clinical intervention or program. Our health technology assessment service, that's a more traditional HTA that looks at the clinical evidence, the economic evidence, and all of the legal, social, ethical, environmental issues associated with that technology. Again, these reports are quite extensive. They come out with conclusions, but they don't go through our expert panels with recommendations. Our optimal use service are HTAs that do go through our expert panels. They come out with recommendations, they come out with tools, and advice on how best to implement and use the technology. And then we also do lots of scanning. Our environmental scanning is where we'll look across Canada or across the world on how a particular technology is being used or some of the policy challenges or clinical challenges associated with that technology. And horizon scanning is where we look to the future. What are some of those future drugs, those future technologies that clinicians, patients, policymakers are going to be faced with making tough decisions on in the future? And again, just a few examples of some of the recent and ongoing projects that we're working on in our medical devices program. Proton beam therapy was an actual project that was initiated because of a conversation I had with your former deputy minister based on some requests on what to do in this field of proton beam therapy. So we did an HTA on that. We've done some work in the dental area on water fluoridation. We're doing some really good work in collaboration with our partners through this Pan-Canadian HTA collaborative that Chris talked about. So we're currently doing two joint projects with Health Quality Ontario, one related to minimally invasive glaucoma surgery, and another one related to internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy for mental health disorders. Interventions for sleep apnea, and as I mentioned, our rapid response program. Lots of other things we do outside of just our evidence reviews. A big part of what we are doing is trying to mobilize that knowledge. So we have a liaison officer situated in every province in Alberta. Genevieve, are you here in the room, in the back? Genevieve is our liaison officer there for you. She's our eyes, our ears on the ground, bringing information to us and then sharing information throughout Alberta. We're really going to look at growing this implementation support activity, and I'll get to that when I talk about what's coming. Scientific Advice is a program we launched in 2015 for a very specific and different customer. Our normal customers are the public health care system, whether it's the health authorities, the hospitals, or the health ministries. In the case of the Scientific Advice program, the pharmaceutical industry is our customer. We launched that because what we've been finding is a lot of the clinical trials in the pharmaceutical space are based on what regulators need to provide approval, market authorization for that drug. They're not taking into consideration what the health system needs or the health technology assessment bodies need. So a number of the HTA organizations have launched these. NICE has one. Throughout Europe, they have a program that they do with the regulators, and ours now. So we give that advice from a health systems perspective, and we get patients, we interview some patients and provide advice to the pharmaceutical company pre-phase 3 clinical trial on how they should design that trial, more from a health system patient perspective. And lots of education, training, and capacity building. We do our annual conference every year, the CADTH Symposium, lots of workshops, lots of other training and events that we both support and conduct. So I mentioned disruption, and to me, disruption in the pharmaceutical space has traditionally or stereotypically been, it's a disruption from an economic standpoint. New pharmaceuticals are marketed and they create a lot of challenges for the public payers and the private payers from an affordability standpoint. With medical devices, that disruption tends to be more disrupting our system, scopes of practice, infrastructure, where a procedure is done, etc. Those lines are now starting to be blurred in that pharmaceutical space. So a few facts in the area of pharmaceuticals. So roughly 6,500 products in various stages of clinical trials, another 15,000 or so molecules in preclinical study. Really important fact there, in the pharmaceutical sector now, about 74% of all of these clinical trials are first in class. Now, potential first in class because it depends on which gets to market first, but that's really important. So a lot of the innovation in the pharmaceutical sector is in new stuff, new things. Now, about 70 to 80% of all of these products will fail in their clinical development process. The areas that are being looked at mostly, and this is based on the volume of clinical trials in these areas, cancer, neurology, infectious diseases, immunology, and cardiovascular diseases. So no real surprises there. A lot of effort going towards oncology. And a really scary figure, $1.5 trillion by 2021. That's a prediction on what the global spend will be in the pharmaceutical space. That's a lot of money. And that the specialty market, rare diseases, these very expensive drugs for small numbers of populations, will be about 35% of the market. Again, creating some really important pressure and stress on our healthcare systems. And lastly here, in 2016, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States approved, I think it was only about 22 drugs. And their approvals are based on what comes to them from the pharmaceutical industry. Last year, there were 46 approvals. And over the past decade or so, on average, it's been about 30 new drugs per year that the FDA has approved. 46, the predictions now is that is the new norm, between 40, 45 new drugs every year. These were the best sellers in 2017. So if you look at these, all of them, all these 5 drugs are biologics. For cancers, for immune disorders. Humira by AbbVie, $18 billion in global sales in 1 year. It's now the second biggest sales of all time, right behind Lipitor. They've made about $100 billion globally on this one drug. Revlimid, $8 billion last year, growing. They predict that that likely will be in the range of about $14 billion by 2022. The other ones, Enbrel, Rituxan, Herceptin, lots of biosimilar pressure now coming in Europe, in the US, and in Canada. So we expect that those drugs will drop on the list of sales, but the actual biosimilars or the drug itself will still see a lot of usage of these. So pressure, which is a good thing from a payer perspective and patients as well, more competition in that drug space. So a lot of people have said that the blockbuster era in the pharmaceutical space is dead. You know, that opportunity, like Lipitor's, getting these chemically synthesized drugs for massive numbers of patients, and creating this blockbuster, this billion-dollar or more drug is dead. Well, I say it's not. Long live the blockbuster. But these are now niche busters. This was just a great saying that I liked. So there's a lot of similarities. We're still seeing big blockbusters, but very much more from a pricing perspective. So this is my list of what I think will be some of the top 5 pressure points for payers, public and private payers, in 2018 and beyond. And this is through some of the horizon scanning that we've done. This is through looking at financial analyst reports. This is through talking with members of the pharmaceutical industry themselves. And I won't go in depth into each of these, but there's a few of these that I think it's important to talk about. So these drugs with novel mechanisms of action, gene therapies, cell therapies, RNA, DNA agents, et cetera, monoclonal antibodies. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in some subsequent slides, these CAR-T cells that are coming our way. There is an explosion of drugs for rare diseases. Again, I've got some slides showing you what's happening there. Immuno-oncology, you saw that list of the top 5 drugs. This is such an exciting field. It's created almost a revolution in research in the oncology community with the monoclonal antibodies, whether they're used alone or in combination with other agents. With a lot of these checkpoint inhibitors, the PD-1s, PD-L1s, new targets for cancer. Where we're starting to see a lot of the pressure now from the oncology and patient community is, although these individual agents, they're immunology agents looking at boosting our own immune systems to fight diseases, is now they're starting to say we need to find better combinations. So there's a combination mania that's happening in the oncology space about trying to figure out what is the right combination of oncology agents and immunotherapy agents to help us cure diseases. There's a lot of research on vaccines for both prevention and treatment of cancers as well, and lots of new targets being looked at. A new disease, or supposedly a new disease, NASH. If that's not in your lexicon, get it in your lexicon. Non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Most people would, in the clinical community, would say, you mean fatty liver? Yes, that's fatty liver. And Sean's going to talk, I think, a little bit about this. His organization is about to do some really good work in this NASH area to try and determine real outcomes. What are the outcomes we'd be looking for in the clinical development? Why I mention this is because there's a lot of people that suffer from fatty liver. It's triggered through obesity and diabetes and dyslipidemias, et cetera. Probably 1 million people or more just in Canada. 10, 20 million people in the US suffer from fatty liver. Not all of them will progress to a disease, a significant disease, but it could generate cirrhosis, cancers, and death. So guess what? The pharmaceutical industry has recognized that, and there are 10 or more drugs at various stages of clinical trials. We expect the first one to come probably in 2019 in the United States. So we're going to have to watch this very closely. And guess what? It'll probably come at a significant price point. And expensive drugs for common diseases. I plagiarized that from Dr. Andreas Lopakis, just a great term to use. We always talked about these expensive drugs for rare diseases. Well, now we're seeing more common diseases, drugs, and these high prices for them, which creates a real challenge from a payer community perspective. So everything from psoriasis to atopic dermatitis, lots of new drugs for infectious diseases, multiple sclerosis, a new era of treatments for migraine therapy. So all kinds of new drugs coming our way for more common diseases. So a lot of excitement is being generated by patient groups, by clinicians. Our role, of course, is to ensure that whatever incremental benefits we receive, we also see that incremental value to the healthcare system. So I wanted to focus a little bit on gene therapy. It's a very active area in clinical development. 9 therapies to date have been approved worldwide, 4 in the United States. And we kind of think of it as an area of research in cancer. Well, it's not just in cancer. Orphan disease, ultra-orphan diseases, some of these common diseases, even diabetes, type 1 diabetes. There's some trials underway to create a cure for type 1 diabetes. These are all wonderful things if we can see it. The 4 that have been approved in the United States, none of these have been approved in Canada yet. The three that I'll mention the most, those bottom three, I'm not going to try and pronounce their generic names. Even some of the trade names get a little hard these days. But Novartis's product was approved late last year in the United States, as was the one by Gilead. It was actually CADTH Pharmaceuticals that developed it, and they were bought out by Gilead. Novartis's product, I've got some information on that. Yescarta, the Gilead one for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, creating a lot of excitement again in the oncology community. And then very interesting, this last one, Veretagine, Luxturna by Spark, is for treating a form of retinal blindness. Now the price of that drug is $875,000 in the United States. However, maybe it's cost effective. If we can cure blindness, just think of the productivity gains that we might make. But I'll leave that to the health economists to try and figure out. So if you want to hear a little bit more about gene therapy, we have a CADTH lecture next week, in fact. Dr. Matt Seftil from Cancer Care Manitoba will be doing a presentation, a 1-hour webinar on this. So if you want to hear it, just log into our website, look at under our lectures, and listen to what Matt has to say. So this is it. This is the Novartis product called Kymriah, and I've even heard different pronunciations for how that is pronounced. So I've got a little YouTube clip here that kind of explains a little bit of the science behind these CAR T cell therapies, chimeric antigen receptor T cells. Could we get you to try and put that video up for us?
The immune system defends the body against disease. T cells are one of its key soldiers, targeting infected or abnormal cells. But cancer can block those defenses. Now scientists are genetically engineering patients' own T cells to make them smarter and tougher at seeking out and destroying cancer. One version is called CAR T cell therapy. T cells customized to zero in on a patient's specific kind of cancer. It all starts when a patient's blood is filtered through a machine that separates T cells and other white blood cells from the rest. Scientists mix the collected T cells with a virus that has been disabled so it won't cause illness. Instead, that virus carries genetic instructions for the T cells to grow an artificial receptor called a chimeric antigen receptor, or CAR, that will track its cancer target and rev up for an attack. Millions of copies of those engineered cells are grown in a laboratory and given back to the patient intravenously. The first CAR T cells are being tested against types of leukemia and lymphoma that bear a marker or antigen named CD19. Once in the bloodstream, those CAR T cells home in on that antigen and grab hold. They release toxic chemicals that trigger a cancer cell's death. As one cancer cell dies, CAR T cells move on to the next, multiplying in the patient's blood until they're no longer needed.
So tisagenlecleucel, or Kymriah by Novartis, it's the first of the CAR T cell therapies approved in the US for ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. 1-year survival rates, 80%. Wonderful results they were receiving in the clinical trials, but very substantial adverse effects associated with it, a cytokine storm. The actual delivery of these CAR T cells will have to happen in specialized centers. They're actually all manufactured in Novartis's facility in the United States. So lots of new indications underway. The first Novartis's product likely will be coming to Canada within the next 6 months or so. We do expect Health Canada to receive it for review soon, and we're already in discussions with Health Canada to do our review in parallel with them, and I think Novartis is open to that as well. So we'll see. In the US as well, Novartis is talking about some very different ways of how they would price this. It's about $475,000 per patient, and that could be quite substantial to payers. So they're looking at outcomes-based contracts for some of the newer indications. They're looking at pricing it by indication. There's talk about some sort of amortization models for how we would fund some of these newer expensive products in the future. So lots of things changing. Orphan drugs, set to be 21% of the worldwide prescription drug sales by 2022. So about an 11% annual growth. That's more than double the growth for all other drugs. orphan drugs. 60 million people in Europe suffer from an orphan disease, 30 million in the US. Don't know the exact figure in Canada. About 85% of people that suffer from an orphan disease, it is very severe or life-threatening. 95% of orphan diseases have no known therapy. So hence, this could really be an explosion. There are incentives in both Europe and in the United States for companies to develop new products for orphan diseases. So the challenge we face, both at the clinical level and at the policy level or the HTA level, is the evidence that we get is usually quite weak. There's a small patient population, very small numbers of patients in the clinical trials. So very difficult to come out with good recommendations for these. The prices are extremely high. Again, we get back to this questionable value, the uncertainty, but the hope for patients who have no other hope, that unmet need. So let's switch to some of the disruption that's happening in the medical devices space. Again, as I said, medical devices isn't just the gizmos, it's things that we look at that are more clinical interventions, things for mental health disorders, etc., dental, medical, surgical. So lots of trends happening in that medical devices space. 3D printing, all kinds of advances in prosthetic limbs, remote monitoring, smart sensors with many of you probably have an Apple Watch or a Fitbit on. More and more companies like Apple and Microsoft and IBM are experimenting and looking for where is the business model for them to get into the healthcare system. Many of these companies are so big that they could just come in and buy out some of these large pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies if they saw there was a business opportunity. So big focus on home and community care, artificial intelligence, and what could we do with all of this big data. Really important in diagnostic imaging, in cardiology, in dermatology. Will artificial intelligence support clinical decision making in the future? And lots of advanced diagnostics and surgical techniques coming our way. Some would say that this is what the future of an operating theater might look like. You see the 3D printer, some good diagnostics right there in the room, robotic surgery, some virtual reality. The only thing missing is the surgeon. So where is the surgeon? Do we need the surgeon? Well, the surgeon could be in another room, he could be at home, or maybe he wouldn't be involved in the future. So, with all that in mind, all this disruption, we've been having some conversations with the federal government about how we could play a different role or a more significant role in that broader HTA community. So we put in a submission to the federal government, and in last year's federal budget, there was an announcement for $140 million for us, Health Canada, the Health Products and Food Branch, and the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. This talks a little bit mostly about pharmaceuticals, lowering prices, access, appropriate use, and affordability. Our funding is also for medical devices as well. So $36 million over the next 5 years to support implementation of what we've referred to as a health technology management strategy. And I get asked a lot of times, what is HTM and how is it different from HTA? Well, we're not throwing away HTA. That assessment, the science, the methodologies we use is still crucial. What we do want to have an increased emphasis on is two things in particular. That whole aspect of implementation support at the clinical level and the policy level, and contextualization at whatever area of the country that technology or drug is being used on. And a big shift in the focus from that point of adoption, where it's a new drug, a new device, and we do a review and we make a recommendation and clinicians start using it, to looking at that technology across its life cycle. And Justin referred to that a little bit about reassessments. And lots of other things that we want to do to support access. We all believe in getting quicker access to patients that have an unmet need. We need to do it in a very thoughtful way. Making sure that technologies are used appropriately. It's the only way we're going to be able to afford them all in the future. And then this whole discussion about affordability. So this is our strategic plan that was approved yesterday, as I mentioned, by the CADTH Board of Directors. 3 broad goals that we hope to achieve, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So starting out with closing the gap between evidence, policy, and practice. So this speaks to that contextualization piece, that piece about implementation support. We are going to start creating implementation support teams across the country. We'll work very closely with the health ministries, the health authorities, to determine how we can best support their policy and implementation needs. We've already created one in Saskatchewan as our test site. We had a very willing health ministry as they were going through a major transformation of their healthcare system in Saskatchewan. So we've worked closely with their ministry. We've hired some additional staff. They are embedding us in some of their decision-making bodies, identifying new evidence needs or different evidence needs to help them make better decisions. We're also expanding and growing that policy analyst capability within our own organization. We've got lots of brilliant scientists and clinicians, but from a policy perspective, we're pretty weak. So we are adding that capability so that our reports will start incorporating policy options and other aspects into the recommendations that we make. And in some respects, it's going back to the roots of health technology assessment. Much more focus on the legal, social, ethical, environmental issues associated with drugs and technologies. Also with this is to strengthen the engagement we have with all stakeholders. And the 2 that I've mentioned mostly here is patients, and we will be creating a patient advisory committee, similar to what we have in our drug advisory committee and our devices advisory work. And we're going to significantly increase the links we have with clinical societies, get them involved early on in some of the work we do. Our second strategic goal is associated with this life cycle approach. We've been doing lots of work over the past 6 months with Health Canada to better understand how they do their regulatory work, looking at the risks, the benefits of technologies, the quality, safety, and efficacy versus the clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and work that we do. So we will be doing some parallel scientific advice, starting with pharmaceuticals, but probably also into the medical device space as well. We've already started to do some reviews in parallel with them. We did a drug for breast cancer recently, worked through some of the kinks in that, and more our reviews will be done in parallel instead of after they do their review. And looking at trying to develop a system of prioritization. When I talked about patients that have an unmet need and there's a new technology that looks like it has a lot of promise, how can we ensure that we're doing work in those technologies before others that are providing less value to the system? That can't be done just from a Health Canada perspective or an HTA perspective. It's a system-wide prioritization that we're talking about. We will be implementing programs for reassessment, drugs and devices, and disinvestment. And we're going to, there's a number of other things we're going to do in that access, appropriate use, and affordability domain. And I put up here as a last one, there are so many great organizations and academic units that do HTA, and we want to build upon that success and create that distributed network of HTA producers across Canada. And lastly, we heard very clearly from all of the health ministries that they don't want us to be static. They want us to look for those trends in technologies and in the health system and to be very agile, very nimble in helping clinicians, patients, and policymakers anticipate and manage that technological advancement. And the word that I put in red there is also influence, because we believe the HTA community needs to take a stronger role in influencing the direction of innovation. That it shouldn't be just the regulators that are influencing the types of technologies that come our way. And we see HTA playing a big role in that. So increase our horizon scanning, the scientific advice. We want to focus more on technologies that do have the potential to improve health and health system needs. And we also want to align all of our priorities, both current and in the future, with federal, provincial, territorial priorities. And those that we see now are supporting Indigenous peoples, rural and remote health care, community, home care, mental health and addictions. Those are some of the areas, and seniors as well, where we'll be doing significant more work in the future. And we can't do this without a lot of collaboration and a lot of partnerships. We received significant funding. We're going to be out there supporting other groups. There's a whole bunch of acronyms on this slide. You don't need to know who all of those are, just to understand that we are doing a lot of this work in conjunction with the Health Products and Food Branch and the Strategic Policies Branch at Health Canada, with the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies, NS, the HTA agency in Quebec, and ourselves, and lots of provincial representatives. We're doing these in a group, we're doing these bilaterally, trilaterally, etc., and then with our HTA colleagues and partners across Canada. And lastly, I think we heard about the upcoming conference in Vancouver, but it is going to be a great year for HTA in Canada. We have our annual symposium in Halifax, 15th to the 17th of April. Our program is almost finalized for that. And then the HTAI annual conference in Vancouver. So hopefully many of you will be able to make it to at least one, but hopefully both of these conferences in 2018. Thank you very much for your attention.